Welcome to the Indie Fantasy Club. Today we're discussing one of the key elements of my ranking system, immersion. World building is the magic behind creating immersive, believable worlds. And it's what transforms a story from just words on a page to a living, breathing universe. Whether it's complex political systems, ancient histories, or unique ecosystems, a well-built world is what makes fantasy memorable and pulls us into places that feel real. So in this video, we're going to break down world building into 5 essential components: environment, bureaucracy, economics, theology, and history. We'll go over each of these topics, looking at some popular books that do an amazing job at them. And by the end, hopefully you'll have a clearer idea of what each element brings to the table and how you can use them to enrich your own fantasy worlds. It is important to keep in mind that you don't necessarily have to have all of these components in order to have an immersive world. But with that said, the more you understand about your world, the more we will be engaged as readers. So you should at least take these things into consideration. So without further ado, let's get into it. Let's start off by talking about one of the most underutilized world building elements, which is the environment. Environment serves as like a foundational layer that shapes the lives, cultures, and challenges faced by many of the characters. A well-crafted environment is more than just a backdrop to fill your story. It directly influences the plot, the societies, and the characters within the story. So I'm going to show you how different environmental elements contribute to immersive world building, and I'll be using Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive as an example of each of these elements, because I think he does a really good job with his series as really integrating the environment as part of the world, and it's incredible. There are really like 4 key elements when it comes to the environment, at least from what I've read. And the first one is landscape, which is just the physical layout of your world. Mountains, forests, deserts, oceans. All of these things impact things like travel, resources, and the very settlements that form. So let's take a look at Roshar. Its surface is mostly rocky and barren, sculpted by intense storms that constantly shape the land and force the inhabitants to build sturdy, fortified structures or to seek shelter in naturally shielded regions. And on that same note, we're going to jump into weather, because obviously that ties in with the main component of the Stormlight Archive, which is the storms. Climate and weather patterns add layers to the setting, and it really impacts everyday life. Things like harsh winters, monsoons, droughts, hurricanes. Each of these natural phenomenon bring their own set of challenges, which affects everything from agriculture to architecture to lifestyle, and nowhere is this as impactful as Roshar and its brutal climate. The high storms aren't just like a natural phenomenon. They are a driving force behind the entire planet's ecosystem and economy, and even the magic system, because high storms provide stormlight, which is their magical energy source. These storms influence daily routines, making them both a life-sustaining and a life-threatening force, which is just so cool. I've never seen really anything like that in any other of the fantasy books that I've read. So if you want to stand out, you can look at the Stormlight Archive and how he uses weather and landscape to really set his worlds apart. Next up, kind of in that same line, would be like animals or creatures that you have in your universe. The native species can add just a unique element to your world. The creatures you create can be used for friendships and companionship, or they can pose threats to your characters, or they can even become religious symbols for a society, especially if they're less common, or they might provide vital resources. Roshar has distinct animals and plant life that is molded based off of the weather and the ecosystem that we've already talked about. Creatures like chols and sky eels, which have those hardened shells to protect them from these storms. And this adaptation even extends to the plant life, which is really cool. So you get the like rock buds, which have evolved to retract into shells and cement themselves to the rock to shield itself from these storms. It's just such a unique concept. And that leads us to the final component of the environment, which is just the races or species that you're going to have as part of your world. If your world includes diverse races or species, the environment can impact how they interact with each other. Their habitats and unique traits can be evolved to suit different settings. For example, a water-based species might live in the oceans or in rivers, while mountain dwellers might have physical adaptations for high altitudes. And Roshar is home to multiple sentient species, including humans, parshmen, and the enigmatic Spren, which are tangentially connected to this world. Each one has adapted in different ways to Roshar's harsh climate, from the Alethi's military focus to the listener's ability to attune to the actual rhythms and soul of Roshar. These adaptations go far beyond survival, and they actually shape their cultures, rituals, and conflicts. So by building an immersive environment like Roshar, Brandon Sanderson really just sucks in readers into a setting where nature isn't a passive background element, but an actual powerful, omnipresent force that influences every aspect of life. So this is just a really good example, in my opinion, of how world building can really enhance your story with depth and realism. And I would say that, as an honorable mention, another author that does a good job of this would be someone like N.K. Jemisin, who uses earthquakes as part of their magic system and a critical component of that ecosystem. Again, that's an honorable mention that also would work really well with a lot of these examples. Moving on to bureaucracy. I know how much we all love bureaucracy, but really this should encompass systems of authority, governance, and societal organizations that shape how people live, interact, and hold power. Again, bureaucracy doesn't have to just be a background element of your story. It can actively influence the plot and character motivations and create conflicts, alliances, and cultural structures that just add depth to the world. And who does it better than George R.R. Martin and Game of Thrones? The world of Westeros is a prime example of intricate bureaucracy, with each element driving the story's complexities and character motivations. So here are the 4 key elements that I think fall under the bureaucracy component of world building. The first one is just the government itself, how society is ruled. Is it a monarchy, a democracy, a theocracy, or something completely unique? This structure can affect everything from decision-making to the distribution of resources. It also shapes cultural values and the expectations that people have of their leaders. So if we look at Westeros as an example, it is structured as a feudal monarchy with the Iron Throne as like the ultimate seat of power. The 7 kingdoms are ruled by noble houses who pledge loyalty to the king. And this hierarchical system obviously leads to frequent power struggles, with each house aiming to influence or control the Iron Throne. Which leads us into the second component, which is politics. A lot of readers love politics in their fantasy stories. Politics represents the ongoing negotiations, power struggles, alliances within and between governments. Political maneuvering can shape storylines as characters try to gain power, protect their positions, or advance personal agendas. Politics in the Game of Thrones are incredibly complex, very vast, very intricate, and also just central to the story itself. Think about things like betrayals, marriages, backroom deals. All of these things are routine in the Game of Thrones as each house competes to gain or maintain power. You have characters like Tyrion Lannister, Varys, and Littlefinger that are just political strategists in the background, constantly maneuvering within the royal courts, making and breaking alliances to shape the very future of Westeros. That is very compelling storytelling. Another component of bureaucracy to consider are just the laws. What are the rules that govern your society? Because those laws reveal a lot of times the values and priorities, which often indicates, who holds power, who's protected or oppressed in some cases. Laws determine justice. They shape class distinctions and create social norms that all of the characters will have to navigate, whether they keep to the laws or they break them. The laws of Westeros often reflect the values and the power dynamics of the ruling class. And, in some cases, justice is often public and brutal. If you know, you know. From beheadings to trials by combat, which kind of just emphasizes the harsh and often arbitrary nature of power in Westeros. And the final thing is just the countries and territories. Borders, cultures, and identities, they vary widely between different countries, each with its own bureaucracy, military, and social customs. Geopolitical dynamics, like rivalries, treaties, and wars between countries, are fertile ground for storytelling. So Westeros actually consists of a lot of different regions. You have the north, which is that cold, frozen climate. You even have Beyond the Wall with the wildlings. Then you have places like Dorne and the Riverlands. You have different islands, and each of these has its own culture, customs, and ruling house. The political and cultural differences between these places often drives much of the story's conflict. The North is starkly different, from the South in terms of climate, values, and loyalty, often clashing with Southern nobility over issues of independence and identity. So keep all those four things in mind as you're building out the bureaucracy of your world. By building a bureaucracy as complex as the one in Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin creates a world where governance, politics, and laws are inextricably tied together to character motivations and the plot itself. And each layer of bureaucracy doesn't bog down the story, but instead it enriches it, and it allows for nuanced conflicts and morally complex characters who are, in and of themselves, products of their environment. So that's another reason why I like to take bureaucracy into account when I'm ranking these stories that I'm reading. I like to know how their laws and their political systems work. So I do take all of this into account as I'm reviewing these books that I'm reading. Now, let's talk money. Economics shapes not only the physical world, but also the social dynamics, power structures, and character motivations within it. Economics pretty much encompasses everything like the distribution of resources, class divisions, industries, and systems of trade and currency, which are a lot of fun in small doses. So by establishing a detailed economic system, indie authors can add realism to their worlds and show how wealth, scarcity, and production influence society's structure and conflicts. As the example book for this one, we're going to look at Pierce Brown with Red Rising. I think that the economics of that universe heavily influences the societal structures and conflicts. And it has all of those things that I was talking about with resources, class divisions, obviously very clearly with their color system. So we're going to start with the first one, which is resources. And those are just the raw materials and valuable commodities available in a world, such as precious metals, minerals, gems, food sources, or technology. The distribution and scarcity of these resources often dictates a society's power structures and influences the rise of industries or conflicts over control. In the world of Red Rising, Mars's primary resource is helium-3, which is a super valuable element that's used to basically terraform the different planets in the solar system and power the society's infrastructure. So control over the helium-3 mining operations is what basically grants power and wealth to the ruling gold class, while the lower classes, like Reds, are forced into brutal, dangerous labor to extract it. Which brings us to number 2, which is value. Societies assign value to various resources, goods, and services, and what is valued often shapes the cultural priorities. A society that values technology might focus on scientific advancement, while another society that values agriculture might place a higher importance on things like land. So let's look at Red Rising. Society places immense value on genetic superiority, with resources distributed based on that rigid caste hierarchy. The different colors represent distinct roles, from the golds, who lead and rule, to the Reds, who perform the menial labor, which illustrates the value system that prioritizes certain superior classes while basically relegating others to servitude. The next one is currency. You can't have economics without some sort of currency. How wealth is measured and exchanged is foundational to trade and commerce. Whether it's coins, credits, a bartering system, currency defines transactions and affects societal classes by giving certain groups more buying power or influence. Now, while traditional currency isn't really a big focus in Red Rising, you can see how power and resources are distributed throughout the books, with the golds hoarding resources, luxuries, and control over advanced technology, where lower classes lack access to these, creating a scarcity of wealth that kind of generates that resentment. Next, let's talk about trade. Trade represents the exchange of resources, goods, and services within or between societies. Trade routes, tariffs, and imports and exports, those are what help shape economies and also influences cultural exchange. With Red Rising, trade is controlled by the golds, and economic mobility is essentially non-existent. The limited opportunities for wealth outside of the elite circles highlights the economic oppression that defines this world, as resources really only flow within the ruling classes and only really benefits them, which is what creates that conflict that drives the entire story. The next one that we're going to talk about is classes, which is obviously really heavily emphasized in the Red Rising series. But as a general concept, economic structures often create class divisions based on wealth and access to resources. And it's these divisions that can lead to tension, inequality, and uprisings, as we see when the lower classes rebel against the elite class. Red Rising is split into strictly divided color-coded classes, with golds at the top enjoying luxury and influence, and the reds at the bottom, subjected to poverty and just terrible conditions. This rigid class structure creates that immense social tension and resentment, which kicks off right at the beginning of the story and eventually leads to that revolutionary fervor among the lower classes. And finally, we can just talk really briefly about industries. Think about the key industries that shape your world, things like mining, agriculture, technology, warriors, manufacturing, and how it drives your society's economy. Because it's often the dominant industries that shapes a region's entire identity, like Mars, which for them, the primary industry for the Reds is mining the helium-3, which is absolutely vital to the Empire's growth and expansion and terraforming efforts. Meanwhile, other castes are specialized in their own unique fields. From the obsidian warriors to the gray enforcers, every class contributes labor that benefits those upper classes at usually great cost to them. So that's a lot to keep in mind. Economics is one of those things where it can be as complex or as simple as you want it to be, but as long as you know how it functions and you can communicate that in a simple way to us as readers, it really can help shape the story. So by constructing an economy where resources, value, and class structure are so strictly controlled, Pierce Brown crafts a setting in which economic oppression drives the plot and the characters' determination for revolution. The economics in Red Rising don't just shape the world, they fuel the series' central conflicts and give depth to the struggles faced by the lower classes as they fight for freedom and equality. So that's just a really good example if you want to look at how economics can really shape your story and really pull you into that world building element. So this just shows you how you can use economics to really be an integral part of your world building strategy. Something else you can use to add depth to your world building is theology. Theology in world building just refers to the spiritual beliefs, religious practices, traditions, sometimes the magical systems that ultimately shapes a society's value in daily life. A well-developed theological structure can influence things like politics, social norms, and even how characters understand their own purpose in the world. When a belief system is deeply embedded into a society, they just drive conflicts, or they unite communities and really provide moral frameworks that characters can either embrace or rebel against. In Dune by Frank Herbert, theology is intricately woven into its universe. Religion, mysticism, and tradition are deeply embedded into the lives of the individual characters and the larger societal structures of the universe itself. So this one has 4 pieces to it as well, starting with religions. Organized religions give societies the moral codes, rituals, and sense of community, and they often dictate the ethical standards and can even play a central role in governance and law. So the universe of Dune is marked by multiple intertwining religious traditions, with the most prominent religious faction being the Bene Gesserit, which is the sisterhood that uses prophecy and mysticism to manipulate societies and maintain their influence. Their belief in a prophesied messianic figure drives a lot of the story's religious tension. Apart from organized religion, I want to talk about the next component, which is just belief systems or ethics. These can include any set of convictions or cultural values that shape behavior. These systems really help people interpret the world around them and can vary widely within a single culture. You can have one person that feels a completely different way than another person within the same religion. If we look at the Fremen, which are the desert-dwelling people of Arrakis, they follow a unique blend of spiritual beliefs that honor basically the giant sandworms, which they see as divine. The spiritual connections to the desert and the sandworms shapes their way of life, their relationships with the environment, and their very interpretation of the prophecy, which of course is manipulated by the Bene Gesserit so that they can get political gain, but that's another story. But that just shows you how those belief systems can be separate from religion. Another component of theology would be tradition, which isn't necessarily religious, but if it's practiced in a certain way, it can almost feel religious. These are the customs that are passed down through generations, shaping the very cultural identity of a society. These can include things like ceremonies, rites of passage, superstitions that can really add like a richness to the world and give characters a sense of belonging or alienation if they don't comply with the norms. So these Fremen maintain strict cultural traditions shaped by the harsh desert environment, including water conservation rituals and rites of passage like the journey into the sand. Their traditions also involve warfare, honor, and a deep loyalty to family and tribe. These traditional customs are both for survival and spiritual practices, making them integral to the Fremen's identity. And the role of tradition is further complicated as Paul Atreides adopts Fremen customs to fulfill his destiny as the potential messianic figure. And so, by embedding rich theological elements into Dune, Herbert creates a world where religion, mysticism, and tradition aren't just passive aspects of culture, but active forces that influence every aspect of life on Arrakis and beyond. The interplay of faith, prophecy, and mysticism fuels the conflicts, shapes identities, and drives complex relationships that define the series. That's how theology can be used to really enrich your world. And finally, let's talk about history. History in world building encompasses things like the past events, myths, bloodlines, and prophecies that shape the present. A well-developed historical backdrop essentially creates a sense of time for the reader, which helps them to get more immersed into the story. History provides the foundation for the society's culture and identity and future, which makes it an essential part of that immersive storytelling. And if we're going to talk about history in fantasy writing, I think a prime example has to be the Malazan books by Steven Erikson. The history is ancient, mysterious, and constantly evolving as you learn more as a reader. This series is renowned for its depth in historical lore, its complex bloodlines, and interconnected timelines that really drive the story forward. And the author does a good job with history because Steven Erikson was actually trained as an archaeologist before he started writing. So he does understand how different layers of history can get uncovered as you go throughout time. There are components that I want to talk about when it comes to history, and the first one is just lore. Lore includes the collected knowledge, stories, and the secrets that the characters know or believe about their world. Lore might explain the origins of magical creatures, significant past wars, or the creation of landmarks, which adds a layer of texture to the present day that you're reading about. And the Malazan universe is rich with the lore about its ancient empires, lost civilizations, and powerful beings. As an example, there is one ancient race who basically undertook a ritual to become undead in order to eradicate another race. And this lore about this undying mission impacts the present day interactions between races and gives it kind of like a haunting depth to the world's history. So the next one that goes kind of hand in hand with this is just the myths of the world. Myths are the cultural stories, which are often of heroes, gods, villains, supernatural events, anything that basically can shape belief systems or inspire people. Myths oftentimes blend fact and fiction as time progresses, carrying moral and spiritual significance, and oftentimes it gives the characters a sense of identity and purpose. And myths and legendary figures are plentiful in the Malazan universe, with stories of ascended beings, powerful gods, and mythical events that the characters often reference. Figures like the Elder God or myths about powerful weapons, those influence the current beliefs and power struggles, as these entities are still active in the world. Next up is timelines, and this is an important one because you need to know your timelines before you start writing your book. So this is something that can often be done during the outlining part of your writing journey, because the timelines are what provide a structured sense of history, which details when significant events occurred and the evolution of societies, dynasties, and civilizations over time. The Malazan world spans thousands of years, with multiple timelines and layers of history, which are only gradually revealed. That's part of what makes Malazan a really complicated book to read, because you have wars that happened eons ago between races that are nothing more than myths. You have the rise of the current Malazan Empire, which shapes the current political landscape. But it's this deep timeline that gives readers a sense of the age and depth of this world and all of the weight that comes with those past events. Understanding how your timeline works and how past events impact your current events can really play into giving your world a sense of just that depth that we want as readers. And finally, I just want to briefly mention this, but I do think it does play a role, and that's just the bloodlines. Bloodlines refer to important family lines, noble houses, or dynasties, with this ancestry often conferring power, privilege, or responsibilities. Rivalries and alliances among the different bloodlines can define social hierarchy and add layers of tension and intrigue. Bloodlines and ancestral powers play a significant role in the Malazan world. Characters are often shaped by their heritage and the expectations of their people. Tension between human and non-human races are often rooted in ancient bloodlines and history, which again lends that gravity to the present day alliances and rivalries that exist. Understanding how bloodlines can impact your magic system or your politics really can also add that layer to that history that helps us get involved and immersed as readers. This complex historical foundation in Malazan gives depth to the conflicts, the motivations, and the cultural richness of the characters, making this story both immersive and profound. But it is complicated, so keep that in mind. Steven Erikson might be actually a very extreme example of this, where it can actually turn off readers because there is so much complexity and depth with the history itself. He doesn't hold your hand as you're trying to figure out what's going on. So be aware of that as you're writing your stories, where you don't want it to be so complex and so deep that it can dissuade a reader from wanting to get involved in the story. And there you have it. That's my criteria for ranking indie authors when it comes to building an immersive world-building experience. Now that we've explored world building and how it shapes your fantasy story, let's dive into just some quick 3 tips that I have for aspiring authors that I think can help them level up their world building efforts. Whether you're just starting to create your world or you're kind of refining your setting, I think these tips will help you build a more immersive and engaging universe without necessarily overwhelming your readers with too much all at once. Tip number 1 is to know 100%, but only share 10%. I think one of the most common mistakes in world building is just overloading your readers with too much information all at once, especially when this comes in the form of
info dumps.
Nobody likes info dumps. Listen, as an author, I know you've probably spent hours and days and years maybe developing a fully fleshed out history, language, or magic system. I know you want to share that with us because it's exciting. You want to tell us everything that you know about this world because you are in love with this world that you've created. But the key is to just share enough to keep the readers intrigued and invested. You don't need to reveal it to us all at once. Just share bits and pieces gradually as the story naturally unfolds. It's okay that we might have questions about your story. That's what keeps us interested. Those types of things make the world feel more alive, as if we as readers are discovering everything along with the characters. And you can reveal these details through the actions of the characters, the setting, the dialogue, but just so long as you're letting the world come to life naturally. Number 2, and we all know this one by now, but it's just show, don't tell. I know it's overdone, I know it's overexplained, but I do feel like it's a necessary tip to have for aspiring authors. So you can skip this section if you feel like you've heard it 1,000 times and you don't want to hear another take on show don't tell. And I'm just going to make this really quick. Showing us your world through actions and dialogue rather than just explaining it makes it feel more real and immersive. Dialogue, when done right, is a great tool for this because it does often let you reveal world building details in a very natural way without necessarily just describing everything outright. But with that being said, you don't want to write something like one of the characters explaining to another, "As you know, the kingdom has been at war for decades." That type of dialogue is just lazy. Instead, you might have the characters argue about the long-term effects of the war on their families, showing its impact through the emotions and choices of these characters. You can even show this through like social structures, where you can get a sense of the hierarchy of the world based off of how characters address each other, or what they're allowed to do or say based on their status. This just keeps the pace of your story moving and lets us learn about your world more organically. And number 3 is create something unique. This is your chance as an author to stand out from everyone else. A big part of what makes world building so exciting is offering us as readers something fresh and original. Try to avoid relying too heavily on typical fantasy tropes or settings that readers have seen before. Instead, try to create unique elements that will surprise and engage your audience. Be bold with your ideas and don't be afraid to push the boundaries of fantasy. Let's see something new. I can promise you, unique concepts will make your story stand out, and it will give your readers a very memorable experience. So remember, if you haven't seen it done yet in fantasy, don't take it as a red flag. Take it as an invitation to do something that's never been done before. And that's it. Thanks so much for joining me today as we explored the art of immersion with world building, along with those quick tips to help you bring your fantasy world to life. Whether you're building an expansive universe or crafting the details of a single kingdom, remember that world building is all about creating a place that feels real, lived in, and full of possibilities. If you found this world building overview helpful, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more writing advice and book reviews right here at the Indie Fantasy Club. And be sure to drop a comment with your favorite world building tip, or let me know some of the things that you like that make these world building stories so unique for your experience. And remember, whether you're an aspiring author or just a fan of immersive fantasy, we're here to celebrate the magic of indie books and the incredible worlds they contain. Thanks again so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.